Hey guys, my name is Graydale, and I'm here to bring you another Genshin Impact Team Comp. As always, this video is not about big numbers but rather focus on synergies and mechanics to help you improve your team or your playstyle. And today we're gonna talk about this team, which I like to call Albedo's Roar. And as the name suggests, this team revolves around Albedo using the Lion's Roar. And if you ask me why or what's the point, surely there are better options than this. But you see, while working on the maths on my previous video, link on the description or up there on the screen, I added weapons that I currently have in my spreadsheet for comparisons. And I was totally surprised by the potential numbers of this weapon. With my excitement and intrigue, I spent a couple of days trying it out. But unfortunately, it doesn't really work well on Electrocharge build because we keep on losing the Electro debuffs. I ended up excluding it as an option and decided to find a comp that can fully utilize it. So, here we are. Now let's talk about the weapon first. Lion's Roar has a decent base attack with attack percent as its secondary. Its passive allows us to deal more damage in enemies affected by Pyro or Electro. And based on my calculation, we would need at least R3 to be as good as Harbinger or Pestering. Now, don't go wishing for Lion's Roar just yet because there's another problem with the weapon. And as mentioned earlier, triggering elemental reaction can remove the debuffs we applied to enemies. So using Overload is a big no. So I just went with one element, which is Pyro, to minimize reactions as much as possible. The downside of this, of course, is that we don't get extra damages from reactions, and would limit our options when fighting Pyro-immune enemies. On the other hand, fighting against Electro enemies will automatically give us the passive of the weapon, or vice versa if you opt to make a team for Electro. It is also easier to play compared to other elemental teams, at least in my opinion. Now, before we go to the build, I'd like to talk about the strategy first, because it may change the weapon and artifact selection. Well, at least it changed for me. The idea is to keep Pyro debuffs on enemies as much as possible, or exactly when I need to. So first, I would want to put Albedo's E so that every attack that I do has the chance to trigger Blossoms. Then, Bennett's Burst to buff the entire team, and apply Pyro to enemies. From here, we can abuse all bursts, but I would start with Ning's Burst and Screen. This, however, has the possibility to consume our Pyro debuff. Then next would be Xiangling's Burst to deal Pyro to a huge area. Then that would be the perfect time to pop Albedo's Burst and skill again. If timed right, Albedo's Burst would still be buffed by Bennett's Burst. Then do some normal attacks or spam Bennett's or Xiangling's skill to refill energies and keep the Pyro up. Once Bennett's Burst is back, we can just repeat the rotation. Easier said than done, right? But the strategy is simple. Alternate between character's element and use Pyro skills during downtime to keep enemies engulfed in flames. With this comp, we will have Pyro and Geo Resonance, which is great because we have attack percent buff, Geo damage buff, and shield strength, along with the ability to regen all our characters' energy faster. This team is also very much capable for clearing higher floors of Abyss. We have Pyro characters for 9 and 10, Ning to block the arrows in 11th, and Geo characters for the 12. Now for the builds, the spreadsheets that I'm about to show you are meant to use as options, and not to identify which one is the best. Depending on your strategy or playstyle, you might want to use a specific weapon or artifact for your character to boost what you need. In the options, I will talk about what I'm using and what I'm planning to use, and perhaps a few suggestions. But I won't dive too deep about these builds because there are a lot of in-depth videos already out there. I'll just post some examples in the description below, so be sure to check that out if you need help finding those guides. Now onto the build itself. First, we have Albedo, and I've already mentioned why I'm using Lion's Roar. But as a summary, I want his burst to deal decent damage while keeping the Blossom's damage on par with Harbinger. Harbinger is a great option of course, but you might need a different healer, or if you're good at keeping his HP full. Festering is good if you want to make sure that you can spam his burst off cooldowns. For artifacts, I would always recommend 2-piece Petra, mixed with any of the following. Gladiator if you want to do normal and charge attacks. Defenders or Gamblers to boost his Blossoms, but worth noting that they are 4-star, so you will lose on levels and substat rolls. I'm currently using full Petra, but I'm planning to use Petra with Noblesse once I get a decent substats for Noblesse. This is of course to boost his burst. Although we won't be utilizing his A4 for reactions, we still get the benefit of having stronger shields. His C2 boosts the damage of his burst, while his C6 increases all party members' damage. For Bennett, he is the buffer/healer, so I'd recommend Energy Recharge Weapon. I'm currently using the Skyward Blade, but for 4-star option, I would use Festering again for the Energy Recharge. But if you're not using Energy Recharge Weapon, I highly recommend that you get it on Timepiece instead. Based on the strategy, his burst would buff all other characters' burst, so 4-piece Noblesse would be nice to get that extra attack buff. And that's what I'm using. If you want to do bigger damage, then Noblesse and Crimson Witch is your best bet. I would suggest at least 200% energy recharge if possible, to make sure you can keep bursting off cooldown. His C1 is super huge as it removes the condition of his attack buff. And his C6 is something that is beneficial for this comp, but I would think twice before activating it, since I'm also using him for my melt comps. Ningguang will be the burst support, and I also use her for breaking Geo shields. My current weapon is the Widsit, but I'm aiming for Solar Pearl mainly for the crit, but also for its passive. Any attacks or crit weapons would be nice to boost her damage, so that's also an option. Her burst has relatively low energy cost, so I would suggest attack percent, geo damage, and crit for stats in artifacts. As for the sets, I'm using full Petra because I want to boost Xiangling's burst even more. So I make sure to pick up some crystal before I switch out. You can also opt for Petra Noblesse or Petra Glads, same as Albedo. Her A4 would grant geo damage for characters passing through her screen, which is again nice for Albedo. Her C2 allows you to spam her skill more often, which is a good source of damage. Xiangling is the burst DPS and the primary source of Pyro. And that's the reason why I'm using Favonius Lance and Energy Recharge Timepiece. If you don't have the Favonius Lance, then Dragon's Pain or either crit or attack percent weapon is also okay. For artifacts, I would suggest Crimson Witch and Noblesse to add more damage to her burst. But you can also go for Witch and Gladiator if you want to. Her A4 drops a buff that can be picked up by any characters to boost their attacks. Her C2 allows her to apply Pyro even more with her normal attacks. Her C1 and C6 increases the effectiveness of Pyro, while C4 extends the duration of her burst. Fun facts: I had to redo the video after 1.3 for the Geo Resonance. But before that, this team was using Sucrose over Ningguang for elemental shredding with Viridescent and keeping the Pyro debuff by swirling. The only downside for me is breaking Geo shields. It's actually a decent strategy if you like Sucrose playstyle. If you still prefer Harbinger after all that, then I would suggest using Noelle over Ning to help heal past 70%. I don't see her as a good support though, so you might build her as DPS and do some normal attacks with her instead. And that's all, folks. I hope you learned something new in the video, and feel free to post your thoughts and questions on the comment sections below, and I will try to answer them as soon as I can. Cheers!